I was at a death and dying expo this morning, and a lot of very interesting things were said. There's one thing that really rubbed me the wrong way, and it was a doctor who's become somewhat of a spiritualist and was talking about the other side. And she said something about how suicide shouldn't be an option, and it's sad if someone chooses it, and that they can then be stuck on the other side. And she sort of left it at that. And I thought, oh,
It's a very big problem, isn't it? Because it presumes that there's, again, the concept of an afterlife, which is really rather interesting. I consider suicide to be very honourable. Having worked with road rescue, having gone to the places where suicides have happened, it depends. I consider suicide can be selfish. In the Northern Rivers region, the number of people who jumped off Minion Falls and left their bodies scattered around the rocks in meat for their relatives to identify, because we haven't got a handle on death and we don't just leave them there, which would be nice, feed a lot of critters, but they don't. And so there's almost a cruelty to the living, those recognizably living. There's a cruelty to this idea of the shattered body. And yet, what about wars when people have had their legs blown off and had half their faces blown off, and there's not really a difference? I've often thought, oh, if it was time for me to die, give me the green dream. And this is the other thing that tarot won't even do. It won't differentiate between one species and another. Just very briefly, as an aside to what you're talking about with the death seminar, the death expo, I read for a friend, the first thing on the table, there's Ten of Swords death card. And there was a real sense of, we had the man, somebody she didn't know, Ten of Swords death card. There was temperance in there. There was a few things. And I said to her that this man was going to kill himself or go into self-harm, but it was really necessary. And so was the green dream. We were actually talking about her dog. So tarot doesn't differentiate species. And her dog is very, very elderly. I don't usually use that word. I'll use it in this instance. But he's also infirm. And the key for her towards the suicide was the green dream. But again, what teaches a person has got to be that gateway, if anything. But what you're talking about, that person saying, that is shaming and shaming and blaming and guilting a person who's had enough of life. What's wrong with becoming compost? It's the quality of the compost, I think, that we need to even address here rather than anything. And there's also whose brother, when we originally did the Redemption of Joe Frame, the film on the fine line between mysticism and madness, and he did jump off Minion Falls. And as we did a documentary on that was called Nobody, and as was saying, he's got no problem with his brother taking himself out of this world, and that's a quote. But we need to discuss that. He said, but what leads up to that? What society does, what society doesn't do, what happens in a community that drives a person to the point where they can't find a reason for living, that needs to be addressed. And that's an important part of this. But there's entire societies who are not allowed to die, as if in some way death is dirty. But how can it be dirty when everything does it? And the idea of another side, this has really got to be addressed, because the other side to what?
and what about the phrase, the veils? You've heard that a fair bit? The veils between life and death, and you've got the unseen, unborn, and you've got the veil of.
Truth is, what does any of it mean? As a skeptic, a mystic skeptic, I've got to ask myself where these terms come from. If you're sitting and you're watching your mother die, she just stops being your mother. There's no veil. There's no light. people have tried to say that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but it's just rhetoric, Mira. Honestly, what it is it's the same story, the same pattern of denial of Earth as a beautiful place, a beautiful being, a living being. It's the same denial of that which is so destructive to everybody's consciousness. And it invokes such fear. And the fear is that living's not good enough, that living is not as significant as what it's still the whole when you're dead you go to heaven, or when you're dead you go to hell. It really is, but it's, and they may not use the words, but that's it. But I'm also aware somebody, I can't really give their name because they're quite well known, who said to me at one stage, I'm going into the business. I said, well, okay, that was a throwaway line. What do you mean? They said, the death industry, biggest one. No one talks about it. It's where all the money is. Or the whole works. And he and his brother were going to go into set up a funeral parlor, because they said that's the one thing that's never mentioned, and it's the one absolute business that's not going to go out of business. So instead of doing that, because circumstances prevented it, they ended up being the people who went and picked up the bodies and put them in the back of the wagon, took them to the, and quite often they had to pour the bodies into plastic bags in Australia, because they may have been discovered days or weeks in the summertime after they'd stopped living as the nurse, and they were full of all kinds of other beasties and creatures, and they were liquid. And this is what we don't want to look at, but this is what we do need to look at. I maintain, look at it, smell it, know what it is. We know what it is, and we accept it with other species, but it's as if we can't really understand. This is such a fear of not being. And that goes into life, into the choices that get made when we're living. And it's been a so-called fear of death that's driven me to look at death so often, and all these messages that I get around what it is and what it isn't. What death isn't is death. The industry, the person that you're talking about, did they make their living out of death? Can I ask?
As far as I'm aware, yeah. And end of life care.
Oh, I'm not muted. I thought I'd muted myself. Excuse me. End of life care. Who knows when life ends? You see, here we go again. This is buying into the medical industry. This is buying into an industry that wants to somehow box and label ageism or whatever. I've got knocked back on one instance of publication because I was too old. And I said to the person, I said, look, I'm fine with that, but I must ask you a question, and I'll leave you with the question before I spit in your fucking face. They said, what's the question? I said, what if I'm 20 and it's my destiny to die at 22? Would you still knock me back?